I am so excited to be able to join with you by video this afternoon, and I can't wait to see what God does in you and through you as we dig more deeply into what it means to follow Jesus. I believe that every single one of you are known by God, loved by God, and called by God. And one of the most beautiful parts of becoming a Christian is that we are invited into a family in which every person has a place, a role, and a call. Every single person. So whether you are brand new to Life Church and faith in Jesus, or you've been a Christian for your entire life and serving in ministry for years, the topic that I've been asked to talk to you about today is vitally important to your faith journey. But I think in order to understand where I'm going, you need to know a little bit more about where I've been, about my own story. You see, I first began to explore my place in the family of God when I was in high school. I had made a commitment to follow Jesus at a Christian summer camp and almost immediately had a desire to get plugged into what God was doing in my local church. I was so overwhelmed with what I had received from Jesus that I couldn't wait to give back. So I quickly jumped into serving with students who were younger than me, and I remember vividly the day that my youth pastor told me that he believed that God was calling me to a specific role within the church. He told me that he believed that God was calling me into youth ministry, and I believed him. There was something in me that resonated so deeply with what he was saying, and I couldn't wait to get started. So I jumped into ministry with both feet, and honestly, I did really well until things got a little difficult in my life during college. It was during that time when I began to doubt my call, to doubt my abilities, to doubt my place in the church, and I even began to have doubts about my faith. So looking back, I'm convinced that the problem wasn't the things I felt called to, but the order in which I was called to do those things. You see, we are called first to Jesus and second to ministry within his kingdom. I want to say that again. We are called first to Jesus and second to ministry within his kingdom. I had forgotten my first call and my first love. What drove me to want to be a part of the church in the first place was what I had received from Jesus. But as soon as I started living out my call to serve, I quickly forgot to depend on Jesus. And during college, what happened to me is that because I wasn't returning to Jesus, because I wasn't going back to finding what I knew I needed desperately in Jesus, my faith began to fizzle. My ability to serve began to wilt away, and I found myself in a dark and difficult place. And I left the church, and I left my call, and I left my first love. And at the end of my time at North Park University, at the time where I was going to school, when I ended up dropping out of college and I was directionless, I didn't know where I was going to go, and I had this amazing breakthrough with God where I rediscovered Jesus. I heard him calling to me again, that personal call to be known, to be loved, to be changed, to be transformed. And I wanted to follow. I learned to be a follower before I could be a servant. And it was beautiful. I spent an entire summer that year in the mountains of Colorado. And I knew that I wanted to jump back in with both feet again and begin to serve again. I knew that. But I knew that I shouldn't. I knew that I couldn't. Because I knew that I needed to spend time sitting at the feet of Jesus before I led other people to sit at the feet of Jesus. So I went up into the mountains, and for a few months I just spent time at my friend's cabin. It was a half-finished cabin that they were building up in the Colorado mountains. And as I spent time in the mountains, what I did is I just spent time with Jesus. I would sit on the shore of the lake with my guitar, and I would just worship. I would just worship God. And the Lord restored to me my first love, and in so doing, restored to me the calling to go and serve his people. You see, all throughout the Gospels, what you see Jesus doing is calling people first to himself. It was always a simple call. Follow me. You never see Jesus giving his disciples a specific task until they had learned to follow him. In fact, the first time that he sent them out with a specific job, he also gave them really specific instructions. Don't take anything with you, he told them. Every single disciple was called to follow before they were sent out. And so what we need to do is check out Matthew chapter 10, verse 1. It says this, Jesus called his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits so they could cast them out and heal every kind of disease and sickness. I don't know where his disciples were before that, but they clearly were scattered a bit, and he called them to himself. He called them to himself so that he could give them something, so that they could then do something. They were being called to set people free. Freedom from every kind of disease and sickness, freedom from any type of unclean spirit, but first, Jesus called them to himself so that he could empower them. They had to gather around Jesus before they would ever find success on their mission. And to be honest with you, I desperately needed this teaching in college when I began to doubt my call. Because, you see, I was out working to set the captives free without ever returning to Jesus to be filled up. And I'm convinced that this reality is part of the reason why Jesus told them not to take anything with them. In that same story, but in a different gospel, in Luke chapter 9, verse 3, this is what it says. He said to them, take nothing for your journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, and do not take an extra tunic. So by commanding them to leave everything at home, he taught them that they had to be dependent upon God for everything they need. Dependent on God for everything, even their very clothes. And so what he was trying to teach them in that moment is to remind them that we are called first to Jesus and second to service. And when we show up when Jesus calls, he never fails to give us what we need. Following comes before serving. And it wasn't until much later in their ministry, right before Jesus was arrested and taken from them, that Jesus gave them permission to start taking anything out with them when they were on mission. As they sat around the table and they shared their final meal together, we call it the Lord's Supper. And he's talking to them about what is about to happen and about what is about to come. In the middle of that moment, of that beautiful moment with Jesus, Luke 22:35 captures something I think it's really important. It says this. Remember when I sent you out with nothing, and yet you never lacked for anything? That will never cease to be true as long as you remember the lesson that I intended you to learn during those days. You are called first to me and second to service. And now you're at a place of maturity in your faith where I trust you to take things with you, but I never want you to forget the first lesson. There's been times in my life when I've forgotten that first lesson. There's been times in my life when I have forgotten my first calling. And when I do, it becomes burdensome to live into the things God has called me to do. It becomes deeply difficult for me to even at times remember what my calling is. And right now, what I know to be true is that I have been called to be the pastor of Life Church Livonia, to be your pastor. And there's a deep sense of responsibility that comes with my call to be your pastor, but there's also an even deeper sense of dependency on the one who called me into ministry in the first place. I love what William Willimon says about service to the Lord. No pastor rises much higher than being a butler. Yet in the topsy-turvy ethics of the kingdom, this is as high as anyone rises, a servant of the servants at the Lord's table. 3 years ago, God called me to the city of Livonia because he wanted me to start a brand new church where real people are called to meet a real God and then to learn to live real lives in light of who God is and who God called them to be. And this isn't just a calling that has been entrusted to me, it has been entrusted to us, to you. But we will fail if we try to do it with our own meager resources. In order to discover your call, you have to first discover Jesus over and over and over again. Right now, what we know to be true is around 17% of people in the city of Livonia have a church home. And I believe that God has called us as a church to change that, to make contributions into the kingdom and to serve in the way that God has gifted each of us and to be a family together that changes that number from 17% to 18% to 19% to 20% and on as we are faithful to the calling that God has given us as the church. But we have to return to Jesus over and over again to be empowered, to be loved, to be known, and to be sent out into our call. As we look at the story of Jesus and his disciples, one moment in particular stands out to me where the disciples really struggled to live into the call that Jesus had given to them. And it was a moment when a man comes to the disciples because his daughter is struggling. His daughter needs healing. His daughter needs deliverance. The very ministry that Jesus had given to them previously, what we read about earlier in my story. And so in this moment, this man brings his daughter for them to heal. And they can't do it. They fail. I wonder what they were thinking in that moment. I wonder what was going through their hearts and their minds as they walked back to Jesus in that moment. Did they begin to question their call? Did they begin to question their gifting? Did they begin to question whether or not they were in the right profession following Jesus as disciples? Were they beginning to think, maybe I should just go back to tax collection? Maybe I should just go back to fishing? I don't know what they thought, but I know how I would have felt in that moment. And so what Jesus does, though, when they show back up, he heals the girl first. He heals her. He delivers her. It's a beautiful moment. But then the disciples come to him in private and they say, Jesus, what happened? Why were we unable to do this? Why were we unable to live out our call the way that you commanded us? And he looks right at them and he says, sometimes the things I call you to can only be accomplished through prayer and fasting. And this moment, what you needed was to remember your first call, to come back and sit at the feet of God, because that's what we do when we pray. We sit at the feet of God. We're empowered. We're reminded. That's what we do when we fast, is we center our lives around Jesus once again. We remember that Jesus is calling us to himself, and as we do that, he reaffirms what he has called us to do and who he has called us to be. I am convinced that God has called us to be on mission together. I'm convinced that God has called you to be a part of that in some beautiful way. But I also know that at the center of it all is Jesus. At the center of my life and at the center of your life must be Jesus. And I commit to you as your pastor to make that my primary calling, to make that my primary task, to be a follower, but then on top of that, to then step out and be the leader that God has called me to be the pastor that God has called me to be for you, alongside of you, and in partnership with you as we live out our call. I am so proud of you. I'm so proud that you chose to spend this entire Saturday learning about who you are and who God calls you to be. And I am so proud of you that you've stepped out in faith to be a part of a risky thing called church plant. And every single week, I see the fruit of your faithfulness. In the past 3 weeks alone, since we started our last sermon series, 4 people have committed their lives to Christ. 4 people in 3 weeks that weren't a part of the family and are now a part of the family, not because of a great sermon, not simply because of great worship, not only because of something happened to Life Kids, but because every single one of us were faithful in our call. That is a beautiful moment. That is why we are here. That is why we are called. Thank you so much for being a part of this today, and know that I am praying for you as you sit at the feet of Jesus.